I see another agent of the rule of cool, an enemy of sense and practicality has claimed victory.
Not so fast.
Alright, kayfabe aside, Sven at Njord Artisan has managed to create a functional whip sword, which is pretty damn cool. Like, you just have to respect the amount of skill and dedication that went into this project, and the result is looking pretty damn badass. So keep that in mind. Very much kudos to him, and you can't argue with how cool this is. What I can argue with, however, is the functionality and practicality, which is exactly what I'm going to do. Sven himself pointed out some of the problems associated with whip swords, if they were to work in real life or not. One of them is obviously edge alignment. This is a problem that he solved. So the way he constructed this, it's not just loose segments attached to a wire or something that can twist, but everything stays aligned. So the edge is always going to face in the direction that you would expect, just like with a sword in its rigid configuration in this case. And of course, there are a bunch of other challenges as well. How do you make it retractable in an effective way, etc., etc. He had to solve a bunch of problems, which he did in an ingenious and impressive way. One of the main challenges with a whip sword is that it needs to be functional in both sword and whip configuration. And if we think about what a sword is and what benefits it has compared to many other weapons, it's strong and durable, it's light and agile, it's versatile. A whip sword obviously gives you some versatility because it has two different weapon modes, so you get two for the price of one, so to speak. However, there are some limitations. For example, thrusting. I imagine if you were to thrust with a whip sword in sword configuration, it wouldn't work so well. Either it's likely to pop the segments apart, because it is supposed to come apart with not too much difficulty. So if you exert pressure this way, where's it gonna go? Like, for one, it can't really flex in the direction of the flat without the segments coming apart. So it may just disassemble itself, or even if it holds together, a powerful thrust may actually damage the mechanism or, disable it altogether. If something bends, and with all of these different pieces that have to fit together pretty precisely, you've now added a bunch of different parts. Normally, how many parts does a sword have? 4: blade, guard, grip, pommel. Sometimes it can be more parts, like the peen block here technically is a separate part, things like that, but there's not all that many pieces. This whip sword has a lot of parts, so each one of those can fail under stress, of course, and then cause problems, cause the mechanism to lock up or, not go back together, etc., etc. Of course, all those extra pieces add more metal and thereby more weight, which is really not what you want. In real life, a sword needs to be light so that you're able to respond quickly to an opponent's attack. If the opponent suddenly cuts at you with a fast sword, you need to be able to defend and counter immediately. And of course, adding a bunch of extra pieces adds more metal and thereby more weight, which is really not what you want with a sword in real life. Again, in a fantasy setting, you have a lot more leeway, of course, because you have super strength and magic and this and that and the other. But in real life, for a human being to use this, even if you're particularly strong, you're still at a disadvantage with a clunkier sword. If the opponent has a fast sword, they can attack you before you're even able to really respond. You need to be able to counter quickly. You need to be able to raise up to guard and counter cut and thrust quickly, things like that, which is a lot more difficult the heavier it is. As far as strength and durability is concerned, it depends on the individual sword. Of course, some of them, like this one here, is quite a wide and thin blade. So this cuts like an absolute monster, but there isn't all that much mass supporting the edge, so the edge can be damaged more easily. But either way, we're still talking a bar of steel, right? So it's going to generally be more durable than a wooden haft. For example, it can withstand, cuts from an enemy weapon to an extent. It can resist bending, and it can absorb impact shock through its entire length. If you chop it up into individual segments, now each of those segments is going to absorb the force mostly on itself. Of course, it's going to transfer to the other pieces that are connected to it, but not as well as one solid blade. What happens when there's a lot of force in one direction on one of those segments? Where can it go? Not really anywhere. Like a blade like this can flex, whereas one of these segments, if it pops out, it might stretch or bend the cable holding it, things like that, and then now suddenly it doesn't fit anymore together. And the same also applies to cutting with it. When you hit something with a solid blade, of course there's going to be a lot of force concentrated on the edge here, and it can damage the edge. But if you have just a segment, then this gets pushed in the opposite direction, whereas the others mostly stay in place, and you only have these connection pieces to resist. So if the force is great enough to bend those and misalign them, now the entire thing, again, doesn't fit properly together anymore. In order to avoid damage, it would have to give altogether, in which case you can't block with it. So essentially, a whip sword in sword mode is not really a sword. It can't really be used much the same way. If you try to parry with it, there is a good chance it just falls apart. You can't really rely on it. You can't rely on it for thrusting. You can't really rely on it for cutting, because it doesn't have as much structural integrity as a solid blade. So at that point, why even bother? You could just as well have the whip sword that's always in whip mode. And that's what Sven did in his video when he did the cutting tests. In whip mode, you encounter some of the usual problems that you get with flexible weapons. One being, it comes right back at you quite often, which we see there in this video. Now, there are ways to mitigate that. As I've talked about before, about flails, if you follow through enough, then you will pull it all the way through and you will avoid it coming right back at you and going in your face. And of course, in flexible mode, you can't block or parry with it at all. Really, the only chance you would have is if you have a knuckle guard, or ideally maybe even a basket hilt that protects the hand. So now you can catch strikes on there, which is something that I've talked about before. The problem with that is now you have a very small margin for error. So if the opponent sees you're about to defend a certain opening, they can just pull it elsewhere, and you just have this much to work with to actually catch it. If you mistime it or misjudge where it's going to be and you miss it by just a couple of centimeters, that opponent's weapon is going into you rather than into the guard. The way I see it, this is really more of a carry method, because if you think about it, a whip sword in its flexible form would be very inconvenient to carry. What are you going to do? Are you going to attach it to your belt and have it dangle around and cut off your legs? Not really. You can't exactly roll it up and stick it in your pocket in this case. So it would make it easier to carry in sword mode, because then you can actually sheath it. So that actually makes some sense. If you simply ignore sword mode as a weapon and just treat it as this is a sharp blade whip, then yeah, that can help you actually in carrying it around. Is it worth the hassle? Not in my book, but hey, the rule of cool, right? If you want to be an edgelord in a fantasy setting, and maybe you also have access to better alloys or magic infused, whatever the hell, that allow the sword to stay together better and make it more durable and solve most of the other problems, maybe even solve the weight issue. At that point, you have something to work with. I would certainly recommend a shield to be able to parry with it, but either way, as said, you can't argue with the sheer badassery and coolness of this thing. So it's definitely pretty neat to see. Check it out, by the way, if you haven't seen that video. It's linked down below. And yeah, It works, and it doesn't, depending on how you look at it. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you had fun.